the downside is that almost inevitably you will find X number of people, I don't know how many they are, and there are disputes about this, X number of people who say, now that I can actually walk into a federal drugstore and buy it, I'll go ahead and do so. Now, this is widely reflected on. How many people in that category are there? The ACLU, at least Ira Glasser, who's the head of it, he doesn't think there would necessarily be any increase in drug taking. His point is that the fact that it's illegal adds a certain allure to it that will all of a sudden dissipate if it weren't illegal. His second school of thought says, okay, they will try it, but having tried it, having had their experience, they will withdraw from it. 98 billion people in the United States have experimented with illegal drugs. Million, sorry. 3.5 million are current addicts, as defined by, did you take one in the last 30 days? Now, if you say, well, 95 million can pull out of it, having done it in school or in college or whenever, there's no reason why you can't project that experience in the future by the number of people who, okay, if legal, I'll try it, and then do it once. Well, now it's very dangerous to do. I would certainly caution against it. All that money that's currently spent on constraint could be spent on education. And by the way, there's no reason not to encourage social sanctions against it. I.e., if you come to work for Mr. Hefner, you can't take drugs. And if you don't consent to have an occasional drug test, extemporaneously scheduled, then don't apply for a job. I'm all in favor of social sanctions for it. It's the legal sanction that I think is killing us.
Now, as a prime debater, would you say that that was a very good summary of the downside? Sure.
Well, I don't think what other downside there is.
Well, let's ask the question about the saying to our young people, yes, this is tough. We haven't been able to make it as yet, and it's so tough and it's so costly. Let's abandon the effort. For some reason I see that as a quite incredible downside, because you're not embracing drugs, as you said. You wanted to make that perfectly clear. You're saying it's too damn tough to achieve.
Well, I would offhand guess that the majority of young people would be encouraged by a finding of that character, because it would tell them that adults are living in the real world. Let me remind you, Mr. Hefner, that the opposition, the illegality of drugs, does not actually affect the quantity of their consumption. As one person put it to me only last fall, it's easy to buy marijuana in Cambridge than it is beer. Why? Because if somebody sells you illegal beer, he forfeits his license. And his license might have cost $200,000, his whole plant. Whereas people who peddle marijuana can do so furtively with no overhead. I don't think anybody would maintain that if you want drugs, you can't find them. The very fact that they're imported and consumed in such quantities simply defies that assertion.
If you become the drug czar somewhere along the past 10, 20 years, do you think you could have been more effective in solving our problem?
It depends on my authority. Obviously, if I was the drug czar. Total authority, potentially?
You are the drug czar.
Okay, if I were the drug czar, I would say, okay, here are the 5 or 6 popular illegal drugs. You can get them at a federal drugstore for just more than the pharmaceutical cost of producing them, enough to sustain the overhead, but enough also to discourage a black market in them. But before you go in there, you're going to have to read a description of what this drug does to you. And if you're in a mood to play Russian roulette, go ahead and take some crack cocaine. because the probability that you will be seriously affected by this is up around 8-10%. So therefore, I would give them all the warning that they needed about the toxicity that they were willing to accept in indulging this habit. But I would not let the price rise to where Mr. Middleman decides that he's going to sell you that crack cocaine, and in order to get it, he's going to thunder around in people's living rooms or steal women's purses or mug people.
Now, you were in the Army. You remember those horrendous films. What you're going to do if you pick up syphilis when you go into town. And you know that the AIDS horror pictures, the horror information, has been about as effective as those old Army films. Not terribly, terribly much more. Do you really feel that accompanying warning would be effective?
Well, first of all, let me distinguish between the two, because AIDS and syphilis are the result of passions that become ungovernable. Lust or love causes people to do things that they wouldn't do in premeditation. Deliver us from temptation, says the Lord's Prayer, i.e. deliver you from that third drink if you have alcoholic tendencies and you're going to go on to the 10th drink. By the same token, people who give in to unsafe sex practices are, quote, carried away. But this would not apply to a relatively clinical decision to buy crack cocaine, because people wouldn't buy it when they were stoned. That's not the way drugs work. You have your trip and you're over it, then you reflect and decide whether or not to go again. So there is that distinction. A second distinction is that there is no way ever to protect people categorically from the results of their own unruly appetites. This is obviously true in sex. It's obviously true in alcohol, and it should be obviously true in respect of drugs. This doesn't mean that equivalent laws to what we now have in drugs should apply to alcohol or to sex.
You know, just 6 months before your now famous, notorious, however you want to identify it, National Review issue in February '96, August '95, you wrote this piece at National Review, Jerry Garcia, rest in peace. As I read this now, I wonder how could the man who wrote this have gone on 6 months later and recommended reluctantly, perhaps, legalization.
Can you remind me of the contradiction